We'd like to welcome everyone here, our students and our faculty, staff, and our guests for what is bound to be a very interesting and informative and we hope lively session. Today, this morning, marks the 5th anniversary of an event that shook our nation and forever changed our lives. And I would like to ask us, before we begin, to share a moment of silence to honor those who lost their lives 5 years ago this morning. Thank you. This morning, as we look back at 9/11, we remember not just the tragedy of those who lost their lives, but the heroic selflessness of those who risked and in many instances gave the ultimate sacrifice in order to save others. On the one hand, 9/11 is about the tragic loss of life, but on the other, it's about the enduring spirit of joining together to help others. Perhaps no organization represents that human spirit in communities across the country and across the world better than the United Way. The city of Little Rock is hosting the national board meeting of the United Way of America. The Clinton School is fortunate to have been asked to participate in that meeting. Some of the students from our inaugural class will be going over this afternoon to facilitate group discussions during that meeting as the United Way begins a conversation about building community. This morning we have a real treat. We are joined by 3 guests who will share with us not only their thoughts about the United Way, but about the role of public service in building community in America. Each of our guests will take just a little bit of time to share their thoughts, and then we'll open up for questions. And Secretary Slater has already let me know that he's expecting to be challenged by the questions from our students this morning.
That is between us.
Certainly the questions will be open to everyone who's here today. So let me first introduce our guests to you. Brian Gallagher has spent his entire career in public service working within the United Way system. He became President and Chief Executive Officer of United Way of America in 2002, where he immediately took on the challenge of transforming the organization to focus on community impact. Today, United Way identifies root causes of the most serious problems in communities and brings together people and resources to address them. Throughout Brian's 25-year career with United Way, he served communities in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Reading, Pennsylvania, Providence, Rhode Island, and Atlanta, Georgia. He most recently served as president of United Way of Central Ohio in my hometown. Dr. Johnetta Cole's long and distinguished career has exemplified what it means to be a true public servant. She is an educator, anthropologist, philanthropist, author, and mentor to many young women and men. She is currently the 14th president of Bennett College for Women in Greensboro, North Carolina. Dr. Cole made history in 1987 by becoming the first African-American president of Spelman College in Atlanta. She is president emerita of Spelman College and professor emerita of Emory University, from which she retired as presidential distinguished professor of anthropology, women's studies, and African-American studies. She visits Little Rock this week in her role as immediate past chair of United Way of America's Board of Trustees. She is the first African-American to lead this national organization. Secretary Rodney Slater, former U.S. Secretary of Transportation, joins us today in his role as the current chair of the Board of Trustees at United Way of America. Prior to becoming Secretary of Transportation, Secretary Slater was head of the Federal Highway Administration, serving as the first African-American administrator in the agency's century-long history. His public service career began after he earned a law degree in 1980 from the University of Arkansas School of Law. He held several positions in Arkansas over the next dozen years, including Director of Government Relations at Arkansas State University, Executive Assistant for Economic and Community Programs for then Governor Bill Clinton, the Governor's Special Assistant for Community and Minority Affairs, and Assistant Attorney General of the Litigation Division of the Arkansas State Attorney General's Office. Secretary Slater is currently a partner in the law firm of Patton Boggs in Washington, D.C., where he heads the Transportation Practice Group within the firm's public policy practice. Would you please join me in welcoming our guests this morning? Secretary Slater, your comments.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Dr. Hemphill, thank you for those warm words of welcome to the three of us. And it's a pleasure to see you and to see Dr. Bruce and Dean Rutherford, Skip, dear friend, and all of the other members of the staff, and clearly the wonderful students here at the Clinton School of Public Service. I am so very, very pleased to be here today, really to maybe offer a comment or two, but for the most part, to bring two of my dear colleagues and friends, along with other members of our board, to see all of the richness, all that is special about Arkansas, to see how this school is very much a magnet for some of the best and the brightest that our nation and that the world has to offer, and to also afford you the opportunity to hear from them. As Dr. Hemphill has noted in his introduction, they are the epitome of what excellence is all about, whether that's the public or private sectors, clearly in the community of philanthropy, but also as they serve as public servants. And so I'm just so very, very pleased to be here. We also join Dr. Hemphill in pausing for a moment. I can tell you that, and maybe that's the way I began with a couple of comments about myself. But I was at Patton Boggs on September the 11th. I had just started there in April of that year, and I'd gone through the summer really kind of weaning myself from being in the public sector, actually, and becoming acclimated to being in the private sector. And the vacation had helped in that regard. We were coming back after the August break, and you kind of figure that out as well. With the Congress out and with most of the administration gone, it's good as a lawyer in the private sector to get some time as well. I learned that the hard way somewhat because I stayed around a little long trying to do a few extra things, and you realize that, hey, when they're gone, that's the time to be out, and when they get back, you've got to re-engage. As a part of the administration, generally, during that period of August, you're probably planning a bit more for their return, or you're going out to the various states to be with members in their home states as they take advantage of the month-long recess. But that, be as it may, the point is, I was using that period to sort of change my mindset, if you will, and to try to become this public sector, private sector operative after having spent so many years in the public sector. So when you go to the office, and at roughly, I guess around 8:30 or so, you start getting news about what's happening. First, I thought it was a small, relatively small plane, because I've actually taken helicopter rides, or I've been on aircraft, and you're coming right into New York, and you see the towers, and you see all that is there, and sometimes it seems like you're just close enough to touch it. So my assumption was that probably a small plane had hit one of the towers. In this case, the first was the North Tower. And then my assistant asked that I watch CNN, and so I was like everyone else. And then the South Tower about 30 minutes later, and then after that, the Pentagon. And our offices are actually quite close to the Pentagon. So after a while, you're able to literally see the smoke from the Pentagon. And you're wondering what's going on. Now, the point is, once you find out about, I asked about our daughter, and I found out about Cassandra, where they were. But the thing that I really want to make, the point I really want to make is that, for the most part, I was thrown back into a mindset of wondering what Norm Mineta was doing as Secretary of Transportation. Okay. And that's basically where I stayed for a good period of time, because that was my orientation. Fortunately, a couple of private sector businesses and clients ultimately appeared on the scene, like Axiom here in Arkansas, that gave me an opportunity to really focus my attention on something I could do something about. So I just acknowledge that because I've thought about that a little bit. I had a meeting the next day with Don Carty, the president of American Airlines. Now clearly, that meeting was about how can I help you in the private sector. And then I had a meeting on Friday, actually scheduled at the World Trade Center with Neil Levin, who was the executive director of the New York, New Jersey Port Authority. It's just interesting to sort of go back, and you're looking at the schedule at the beginning of the week, and you've got these activities that you're involved in, and lo and behold, just like everyone else, something happens and just throws everything into a different kind of spin and the like. The other thing that was quite interesting, once that it became clear that it was a terrorist attack, I had actually participated in a simulation maybe 6 or so months earlier. About a year or so earlier, where we were testing for a biological attack. And long story short, I had the good fortune of just imagining myself in the role as the president for that. And I remember being shocked into the reality of that exercise by having someone say, once you got to the secure location, your wife and daughter are fine, we've located them, but Mr. President, we're under attack. And so we walked through over the course of a day the significance of all of that. Interestingly, the one thing that I recall that I share with you was the fact that at some point over the course of the day, it was imperative, essential, that the president appear someplace behind a podium with the seal of the U.S. on the front of that podium, saying what had occurred to the best of his knowledge and his team's knowledge, and then to say in so many words, we've got a handle on this, and not necessarily everything that is under control, because you don't want to go that far, but you do want to make the point that we have a handle on this. We generally know what's going on, and we're dealing with it. That's the key thing to have noted and said in some significant way. So at some point, the president and his movements had to make it someplace to do that. And he was able to make it back to Washington, which was critical. And so, again, I sort of offer that because that's where my head was during that period. And it took a little while to get out of that. Now, last point I'd like to make deals with Axiom. You should know that that is a wonderful company. And as soon as the names of the terrorists were revealed, within 2 or 3 days, they actually had information on 15 of the 19. And they were able to show connections between those 15 and other individuals. And so it created a pool of roughly 200, 300 people. And that information was shared with the FBI, the CIA, the White House, the President, and the like. And so Axiom, interestingly, a company located in Arkansas, was able to play a very important role in that whole process. Now, public service, Norm Mineta was the best person in that seat at that time. And we'll talk about that over the course of the discussion this morning, possibly. But having been in that seat at that time, frankly, it was pretty good for me to be where I was as well. In the private sector, but taking public sector experience to help players in the private sector play out their roles. And Axiom, the various airlines, and other individuals involved in that process. And so I kind of close with this point. I think public service and the public arena is a wonderful place to gain experience. And a lot of times you can get it there earlier, really at the point of action, than you can sometimes in the private sector. And that would hold true, I think, for the nonprofit community as well. And when you hear from my esteemed colleagues about their experiences, you will find that at young ages they were in positions of leadership. And they have taken that leadership experience and they brought it to many, many facets of their professional growth and the various circles of leadership in which they found themselves over the years. And so this School of Public Service, Public Policy, is a great place to be. And it's a place where we have to have the best and the brightest so that you, finding yourself in the position of a Norm Mineta or Jane Garvey, who was the FAA administrator, or frankly Don Carty and others with the various airlines, or young public servants in the White House or in the various other agencies of the Bush administration, would be ready to deal with the task and the challenge at hand. And so it's good for us to be with you, to share our experiences with you, but it's also good for us to be with you so that we can hear from you, because United Way is about the old and the new. 120 years old, but also an organization that has to have the benefit of new ideas, new thinking. And with that, I'll rest and say, give us all you've got, because we need that to remain viable. Now with that, let me just maybe turn to first to Dr. Cole. And
I think it's the brother president going next.
Okay.
Am I right?
Yes, as a matter of fact, Mr. Gallagher is next on our...
Okay, very good. Well, now we know who the chair is, right? I've been, so we'll go to Brian and then we'll come back to Dr. Cole.
Well, it's, I'll stay seated unless you need for me to stand.
Can folks see you in the back?
Stand?
All right.
Okay. Well, first of all, as most of you know, the way nonprofit organizations work is that these are my two bosses here. So when the media pastor says you go next, I go next. It's really a great pleasure to be with you. Just in some quick conversations this morning, the few things that impressed me about the program that you're a part of is its focus is on leadership, and more and more as I live and work, functional training and expertise is important. Leadership is what's required. And so the focus on leadership, the focus on applied learning, that you're in the field more than you're in a classroom, I think is critically important. And the fact that your focus is so global. I hadn't thought to do this, but listening to Rodney's comments make me probably start with where I was on September 11th, but importantly in the context of how I viewed service. Because as the professor said, I've been in, my whole United Way career has been in local communities. And I've always found working for a local United Way, and especially in Columbus, getting to be the local executive, it's just one of the best jobs in the world. You get to see all parts of a community. Business leadership, political leadership, neighborhood leadership. Work with rich people and poor people and white people and people of color. No one sees a community the way that I grew up in my career seeing a community, and I never had to travel. And as we were going through the search process that brought me into this job, that process was delayed because of the attacks on September 11th. And my wife and I were having conversations about whether if it were offered to me, whether I really wanted this job or not. Our daughters were in 8th grade and in 3rd grade, and I knew that I'd be on a plane at least half of my life, unfortunately more than that. And what it did for all of us, for me, and for our family, is to talk about service. How committed are you to this? And it was, what I realized is that it reminded me that the decision was so far beyond my own individual interest or United Way interest, and it was back to when I started in my career. It was all about what responsibility do you now have, and that's at the end of the day why I decided to continue to pursue the job. I felt a sense of responsibility, not of vengeance, not of anything more than. I can remember having this conversation at home and with colleagues, is that if you're not prepared to provide leadership, and from this perspective, voluntary decisions to stay engaged in community and public service, then who will? The responsibility was that great. And for the first year, I wondered about the decision. I don't wonder about it anymore. I'm thrilled that I made it, but it came back down to what's your responsibility in service to your country. And now, as I've learned, your country as a global citizen. And so, I would start this way in terms of my view of public service and just community service. Is that I'm like a lot of us, and I would say most of us. Sometimes we're more cognizant of it than not. I'm a product of service. I'm a product of both formal public sector service and programming, nonprofit sector programming, and just good people, just good citizens. Growing up in a family that was, fairly dysfunctional and not a lot of resources, you take all the resources you can to piece together getting ahead. And so, I know what it's like to live on public assistance and go to the grocery store with food stamps and kind of how folks look at you and so forth, but that's at times the way we kept it together. And I know what it's like to be the recipient of professionals and volunteers in youth programming that gave me a safe place to go after school and on the weekends. And just as importantly, and I have to remind myself of this all the time, that I'm a product of an individual who happened to be volunteering as a basketball coach, who took such a keen interest in me that he made sure that I got drafted onto his Little League baseball team, his football team, his basketball team, and more than that, he, knowing that going home wasn't always the most pleasant experience, he brought me to his home and met other kids and families that I wouldn't have met. And while in our house, the first three kids, my older brothers and sister, weren't thinking about college. In fact, I think at one point they were all kicked out of the house. But I was in somebody else's house, and they started getting me thinking about college. And so I was the first to go to college, and one of the things I'm most proud of is so did my younger brother and sister, because they saw a different example. My point is that in these roles, sometimes we think it's about formal programs, nonprofit or public sector, and it is. But I was probably most affected by a person that took a very keen interest in me. So it was that set of experiences that just got me wondering as I went to school, how does that happen? Why are nonprofits there, and how do people volunteer? And so it got me on a social work track. It's as I started looking for opportunities in social work school, and we had to do a practicum in the community. I literally had not heard of United Way. But as I was reading the descriptions of what my opportunities were, I read the description of United Way, and it went something like, this is an organization that brings individual interests together into collective action to try to identify the most important issues in the community and put resources against to make progress. I said, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do. And so that's what got me started on the local path. One of the things now that, as I think about the future of service and the role of citizens in society, as I look over the 25 years, we thought of ourselves forever as a fundraising organization. One campaign for all, bring a bunch of agencies together, raise money for them, give them enough money to have impact. As
as the world's changed, we've doubled the number of nonprofits in the country over a 15-year period. Technology has changed everything. Globalization has changed the social conditions in community. We had to think differently about how we do our work. So we started looking at programs instead of just raising money, housing programs, school readiness programs, and so forth, and started making progress on programs. And now I look at where we are today, not just as United Way, but as an economy and as a nonprofit sector, and realize even with the billions and billions of dollars that we're putting into programs, both public sector and private sector in the country, we're not making enough progress. At a time when the training and education and preparation that young people need to get ready for college or the next stage of life, we're going the wrong way. We're not training as many young people in public education and other venues as is required for today's job. What's absolutely required for a growing, stable society is a strong, growing middle class. We're going the wrong way on it. And I would say that we're part of the problem as the nonprofit sector, in that all of our systems were built for the national industrial economy. And we have to change our systems in order to make sure that the resources that we're putting into trying to help folks get ahead is really people-centered and not system-centered, our systems. So I think what we're now faced with is, how do we put whatever our investment is in whatever issue, whatever program it is, into economic success frames? How do we help more individuals and more families get ahead economically? Because at the end of the day, that's what provides stability. We don't want more and more folks dependent on our programs. We want more and more folks financially, emotionally, socially independent and able to sustain themselves. Last thing I would say to finish is, we've had the opportunity now to travel together internationally. And one of the things I think we've taken for granted in the U.S., and you see it now as you travel around the world, is the critical role that voluntary association and service plays as the third leg in the stool in terms of successful, stable societies. Obviously, you need effective, transparent government. You need a robust business sector and capital investment and so forth, and you need a voluntary sector. You need voluntary association. The visit that we made to South Africa was fascinating in that here's a country that's rebuilding all of its systems: education systems, housing systems, political systems, and I was struck by the fact that one of the issues that South Africa has is the immigration from all over the continent because of the opportunity there. And as I thought about it, the presidential transition has been orderly, has been transparent. President Mbeki, after President Mandela finishes his second term, steps out, new election, so forth. So transparent, effective government that gives confidence to business to invest in country, that brings voluntary association, the three things working together. You saw the same thing in Ghana. Clearly, that's what China and India are focused on. And I think we in the U.S. have to get back focused on the fact that volunteers, voluntary association, service is an ideal, has got to be part of what keeps us stable, strong, and effective as a country. I think what you're studying is that important.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cole.
Thank you. Well, good morning, my sisters and my brothers all. Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to make a statement that I can defend. I'm going to begin by saying that you, as the students in this Clinton School of Public Service, that you are heroes and sheroes. And to be here on a day that is September 11th is nothing short of humbling. You're heroes and you're sheroes because you have made a commitment to serve others, which at the base means that you understand that we got to fix this world. And without debating what led to the horrific actions of September 11, 5 years ago, we know this world needs some fixing. So I want to express deep, deep gratitude to each of you for this decision. It's in no way to belittle what others do in the private sector, but it is to lift up your choice for service. I've been thinking a lot about what that word means, and in particular, how the three of us connect to it through what is traditionally called public service and what is traditionally called community service. And you know, we probably would do well to blur the line and just stick to service. Couldn't help but think about an individual who in so many ways epitomizes service. And I'm thinking about our brother Martin, the man that Nina Simone called the Dark Prince of Peace. Dr. King had some words that I have just got to lay down this morning. Listen to these. He said, anybody can be great because anybody can serve. Went on to say, you don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. He then said something I disagree with. I'm a college president. He said, you don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. I really, really prefer that you do. But Dr. King went on to say, listen to this, all you need to serve is a heart full of grace and a soul motivated by love. Now, I know we're in the academy here. You're in a school. You're working towards a master's degree. Why would I raise something so soft? Some might even say so schmaltzy, as a heart full of grace and a soul motivated by love. Because I really believe that that's at the core of service. If you are not driven by love of a better way for this world to be, you're not driven by some imagination even that it could be better, then I don't think you would be here. I have a very strong sense that my own engagement in this range of service is tied to four key points in my own life. The first, of course, is where I come from. You all know that wonderful African proverb that says you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And I realize that where I'm going is in so many ways connected to where I have been, to my family, to the community that I grew up in. And there are times when the three of us, either individually or collectively, talk about that, about the deep, deep roots that the brother secretary has in this place about the deep roots that the brother president has in a family that may have set great challenges, but in a community that responded to those challenges. And for me, it was Jacksonville, Florida, in the days of intense Jim Crowism, but where I witnessed and participated in folk deciding that they weren't going to just take it. And that meant that a community not only said that Jim Crowism was wrong, and that they would take public stands against it, but a community where folks said, we have to serve each other. Where it was not unusual for a family literally to take on another family, for a child to be brought into a family where there were no biological connections. And so I just thought this was the way it was. I just assumed this is what everybody had the responsibility to do. And I've often said now in my much later years that I kept hearing stuff that really propels me still. I mean, you know, older folk, when they get on something, it's like white on rice. They won't get off. They just keep saying it over and over and over again. But you understand that repetition, when it comes to education, it's good for the soul. And so I heard repeatedly, doing for others is just the rent you got to pay for living on this earth. That's at the core of service. Doing for others. And because I grew up in a very Christian-oriented, black church environment, the other one I heard repeatedly, but I know it's in the Torah, I know it's in the Quran, I know it's in all sacred texts, but it was brought to me constantly out of the Bible. From those to whom much has been given, what's the rest?
Much is required.
So that really set me, my family, watching my great-grandfather, watching my mom, my dad, my community folk, the YWCA folk, becoming a little brownie, seeing that folk in that community loved the idea of a better way and were committed to participating in making it that way. The second point I would think in my life, in my work, has really been the role of education. The role of education and its connection to service. You know, it took a while for me to really get it, but I got it. And that is that service on the one hand and intellectual engagement on the other are not disconnected. So much so that I've come to see education now really as having two fundamental roles or functions. One, anybody will tell you. If you're well educated, then you come to know the world better. You've come to know more about the world. And that should always, of course, include oneself and one's relationship to the rest of the world. And it can include all kinds of complex stuff. Yeah, the second theory of thermodynamics and physics, if you will. But individuals who accumulate that knowledge have only done, in my view, the first step in being well educated. Because the second is to come to understand one's responsibility and carry it out of helping to make the world better. So without the latter, one has not become a fully educated woman or man. It's been my privilege to work in academic settings where this is very understood. It's Sister Ngoui's School, it's Spelman College, and now at Bennett College for Women. Now, only 2 historically black colleges for women in this country. It was just understood. In fact, you couldn't graduate from Spelman, and you cannot graduate from Bennett without a certain number of hours of community service. And it's taken our academy a little while, we're still not there, to really understand service, to understand how you connect the epidemiology of AIDS, learning about that with working in a hospice with the victims of that horrific modern plague. But we're getting there. We're getting there to understand that no matter what you can get out of a book, until you begin to see it experientially, you haven't really gotten it. And I've been very fortunate to have as my discipline anthropology, a way of looking at the world that really sees on the ground what service is about. The third experience that I would lift up of the 4 is very connected, in fact, to the extraordinary individual of public service after whom this school is named. I was unusually fortunate to be asked to work on the transition team when President Clinton became our president. It was a time when I was at Spelman College. It took a big decision on the part of the board and even the faculty and certainly my students that I would leave Atlanta, Georgia and move to Washington and serve in that capacity. And they laid a lot on me. I could understand I was to, in quotes, head the transition team around education. I was cool. And then they said, and labor. I said, oh. And then they said, and arts and the humanities. And I said, oh.
Yeah.
You can imagine what a privilege it was, what an humbling experience to be asked to participate on that team. But I also am going to raise something now that full transparency requires me to raise. And I'm going to do so, I am conscious of the time, but I'm going to do so to remind you about what service can bring as a challenge. During that time that I served on the transition team, I experienced intense, brutal red baiting. Somehow somebody got a hold of some notion that President Clinton was about to appoint me as Secretary of Education. And the far, far right got a hold of this and decided to attack me, and I think really to attack the new Clinton administration. Lifting up my involvement with the country called Cuba, where indeed I had traveled to that country many times. I think I was probably the first anthropologist since Oscar Lewis to do field work in post-revolutionary Cuba. It was a terrible experience. And I think it is naive of us to talk with you about all of the glories of public service without telling you or reminding you of the perils. And I know that for many, it has become now a deterrent. I don't want my life exposed. I don't want people ripping me to pieces. I'll just do my little private stuff over here. We can look at Dr. King and what he went through. But I tell you, as one would say in Spanish, vale la pena, worth the effort, whatever it takes, as long as you know that ultimately you are working in the interest of serving others. The final big influence, I think, on how I look at the world and how I move through it is United Way. And I'm going to bring full circle because back in Jacksonville, Florida, Brother President and our Brother Chair have heard me reference this so many times. See, I'm old enough to remember the red feather. When it wasn't the hand, but it was the red feather on the windows in my home. The red feather that my parents wore. I used to say, well, I want to grow up and have a red feather too. That was community chest. And over the years now, to have the privilege of being profoundly attached to this way of serving, it's been really quite something. And though there's all kind of splash to being in the national arena, we come to you from United Way of America. As Brother President Brian Gallagher put it, the real joy is on that local level. The real joy is in working in a community and seeing, as the old folk in my community would say, with your own eye, the ability to help to transform lives. Of all the things I've done, though, with United Way, whether it's working locally, working nationally, helping to create a movement that we now call the National Women's Leadership Council, realizing that we women are philanthropists too, or working to help to create the African American Initiative, or to bring a greater sensitivity about diversity into United Way. Still, the sweetest moment for me is when through a United Way agency, I connected to a young girl, to a Miranda Smith, who is 11 years old, and today is 18, and still we're in a big sister, little sister relationship. The sweetest moment on that individual level that Brian talked about when his coach grabbed him. But being Miranda's big sister, sweet as it may be, must also remind me that we've got to work in circles that go bigger and bigger and ultimately reach into the world. So when we made that trip to South Africa and to Ghana, it touched me deeply to see Miranda's little sisters all over that continent, and to know of the absolute importance of making sure that the girl child is educated, that all folk are educated and served. So thank you for having us to be among you, and whoever chose this day, what a meaningful moment for us to be here.
Very good. Excellent.
Thank you so much for those wonderful comments. At this time, we'd like to open it up for questions and dialogue. Do we have Octave?
Yes, I have a two-part question. Can you all hear me?
Very well.
Given that we are training to be global leaders, would you summarize your thoughts on good leadership and its characteristics? That's part A of the question. And part B is, how do you suggest we apply these characteristics when we are working with the community?
How many hours do we have?
Well, I'll take a shot. In terms of the leadership portion of the question, one of the things that I've learned that both through my own experience and observing others, and it's a mantra I have in my head, is community first, organization second, individual third. That whenever I watch other folks put the broader interest first, it may take a while, but it eventually their organization will be well served and they will be well served. And I've also seen just the opposite, that folks that even in service, when they put themselves first, or they put their institution ahead of the interests of community, however you define community, geographic or a community within a geographic community, sooner or later they are not effective or fail. Because especially in what you're studying, what you want to be, is these are not command and control jobs. It's leadership of influence and idea and greater purpose. And so the more that your leadership can pull a diverse set of interests together around a bigger idea, you'll succeed. And just the opposite, in my experience, is true, and that's how I would therefore engage community. That a grassroots neighborhood organizer has as much influence over the biggest financial institution in a community, in that they can stop a lot of what the bank wants to do, or they can help the bank succeed. And so in terms of working with community, I've always found mutual respect, understanding strengths, connecting interests into some bigger whole, and the large institutional leaders come to understand that they need grassroots leaders and vice versa. And I think that's the magic of when you engage community.
I agree. I would say amen and a women too to everything that the brother president has said. And I want to begin with Brian's last comment. I tell you, Aretha Franklin really got it. And it's not just about individual relationships, but R-E-S-P-E-C-T. Any leader who does not respect the folk among whom she works is no leader at all. Mm-hmm. And for so long, certainly in community work, we haven't had that. You're not respecting someone when you go into their community and assume that they cannot themselves lead, that they've been sitting around waiting for you, the great Savior, to come. When you assume that there are no assets here, only liabilities, what's wrong with these people? But not to worry, you have come to lead them to salvation. It's a horrible attitude. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, gives me peace, because I've traveled into a lot of communities through my United Way work, it's to see leaders who are humble. Humble. How can you be a leader if you're not humble? And then how can you be a leader if you take yourself too seriously? I mean, your work, yes. Always take your work seriously. But if you think that you are the greatest thing to ever happen to a people, how sad. And then I just want to add a couple of others. There's a wonderful expression, I try to remember it. You can't lead where you won't go.
Amen.
And so the idea, and Brian lifted it up, of this command approach to leadership. I command you to. If you're not willing to do it yourself, why would anybody else want to do it? If you're out there way ahead giving commands, you're not a leader, you're just taking a walk. There's nobody behind you. And then finally, I would say that anyone who wants to be a leader at the service of the public, or I prefer the people, has got to have integrity, which is totally of the highest order. You know, it really hurts when we see what has happened in the corporate world, in the private sector. I mean, just behavior that is nothing short of criminal, of obscene. But if you consider yourself at the service of the people, and you then do things that lack integrity, then I cannot think of anything more shameful.
I would offer just a couple of thoughts. One, I think vision and vigilance, because I do think that you have to be able to see beyond. And I think it was a gentleman by the name of Leroy Eames who said that a leader sees before others see, more than others see, and farther than others see. Now, if you get full of yourself in that regard, clearly, you can be out having that walk. And if your heart is not right, you can lead in the wrong direction as well as the right direction. And so just having that ability is not the sum total of what is necessary. But clearly, having that ability is part of it. And then finally, the point I want to make on that I see these as sort of two wings, if you will. The other is vigilance. It's one thing to know and to not do. I've left so many dreams on the table. But in that sense, I'm just glad that you only have to be faithful over a few things. And so there is hope. But you have to have the faith to follow through on the inspiration that's given you. And all too often, again, it's like you're trying to pick up sand. You scoop it, but you don't close the fingers, and you don't carry the idea, the opportunity forward. And you learn from those experiences, and you saddle up again, and you move forward with it. So vision and vigilance, I just mention those two as being, I think, essential. And then the one thing that Dr. Cole has mentioned, Dr. King, and one thing I'm doing this year that is kind of interesting to me personally, but I think it goes to this question, is I'm following I'm trying to learn as much as I can about the year of 56 and the Montgomery bus boycott unfolding. Because what's interesting about that is that it took 381 days. That's a long time. And the most successful bus boycott up to that point was roughly 2 or 3 weeks in Shreveport, Louisiana. And there was just a lot going on during that period that took, a 26-year-old, 27-year-old, thrust him into a position of leadership, and he had to basically sustain it over that period of time. And victory was not assured. But the ups and downs of that period really, I think, are quite insightful. And there were people along the way. I think we've all sort of mentioned those who are there for us. Yesterday, you should know, before getting here, I stopped in Memphis and made my way to Cotton Plant, Arkansas, to see my dear grandmother, Mrs. Bessie Gleason. And, you know, I do that from time to time when I get the time, because I have to have that grounding. And by the way, she gave me some tomatoes so I can share with everyone. But my point is that what I find striking throughout this period in Montgomery are statements by individuals like Sister Pollard, who's mentioned, and others who say things like, you know, my feet is tired, but my soul is rested, as she just continued to walk and not accept a ride. Or when Dr. King talks about facing some of his lowest moments, and to have people like a Sister Pollard. You know, Sister Pollard was not very polished, but she was a polisher. And to say, you know, things like, you just don't seem, brother pastor, to be as strong. Is it that the weight of all of this is getting to you? Well, you should know that you're our person. We have selected you, and we will not abandon you. You know, we will be here for you. And if you have the faith to step out there, and if it's for the right reasons, people will be there for you. And it's essential, it's necessary that they be there for you, because it is a treacherous and dangerous and unnerving and difficult sort of process. And you do, though confident, always, and I think appropriately so, question. Am I still on the right track? Am I in this for the right reasons? You know, after taking the job and thinking about it through that year, and then once you kind of give yourself to it, you come to that magical moment where everything becomes certain.
For a while.
For a while. For a while. But the clear point is, and I think it was, and I'll close with this, there's a great book called The Cycles of American History by Arthur Schlesinger. And he gets into this last point I'm going to make, and he says that the greatest opportunity for leadership is during the greatest period of uncertainty. The line is shorter. Okay? And that's the greatest opportunity, and that's why faith and some degree of kind of feeling it, knowing it comes into play. But then once you step into it, you do come to a point where you know, but then if you're continuing to step with it, you're still forced to believe in more than you see. So.
Okay.
Well, you started to touch on what I was going to ask you three about. You talked about knowing when to take a break, and earlier when you were talking about stepping into this new job and realizing that August is the proper time to sort of maybe take some time for yourself. And Dr. Cole, you talked about the different trials and how public service isn't always easy. And Mr. Gallagher, you talked about sitting down with your family and really making a decision. I'm curious how you find time to keep your well-being strong and healthy, and to also nurture personal, family, and friendship relationships. Because obviously public servants have to be strong of themselves to help others. And I'd like to hear from the three of you how you do that personally.
That's a good point.
Well, I will begin by remembering something that my mom would often say. And I'm sure she wasn't the only mom who would say this. I would be given instructions to do something. And, ooh, the delight I would feel if I could catch my mom in a contradiction. Because she had just told me to do something, but I noticed she hadn't. And my mom would say with great authority, "Girl, do as I say do, not as I do." To be really honest, I'm going to have to say, do as I say do, not as I do. It is a struggle. It is a constant struggle to create and sustain the balance that we need. It's not that we don't know about it. We know all of the things we need to do. From eating properly, to getting the rest, to making sure that we exercise. I would add to having those moments of meditation when you touch your own soul, when you actually listen to silence. But finding the way to do all of that, and especially to care for and nurture those exquisite, wonderful relationships that you have with family and friends. We know that we're better leaders when we do all of that. And yet sometimes we just don't do enough of it. I remember seeing an article that featured Brian Gallagher and his family. And maybe you'll talk about that, because I really think of all the leaders that I know and work with, Brian may be among the more accomplished in creating that balance. I can tell you I am still struggling with it. But there does come the moment when you have to say to yourself and believe it. If I am committed to serve others, how can I do that well if I am not whole? And to be whole means you must take care of yourself physically, you must do it spiritually, and I think you must do it in terms of your relationships.
Well, one, I would concur completely that it's like anything that on any topic that you start with, it's a balance. It means that you're constantly working on it, and trying to be cognizant of when you're out of balance. Because I think when things get really bad, it's when you don't recognize that things are out of balance and getting more out of balance. And then you get to it could be a personal relationship, a family relationship, it could be work, it could be anything, that it then gets to a point where it's destructive. And so I think self-awareness is really important. I find that I'm lucky in that, for whatever reason, what gives me strength is my family. Is that it's my wife Ramona and our daughters ground me, and Johnetta and I have talked about this a lot. In that, growing up in a male-dominated house, this is just reward right here. This is and it literally therefore balances me. You know how shocked me that women think differently than men, and so the connection that I have, with my daughters, is what centers me, and so I make time for it because I know it helps me. What suffers is I'm not a very good friend. I won't sacrifice the relationship with my wife, and I won't sacrifice the relationship with my children, but I know consciously that I sacrifice my relationship with friends. And it's interesting. I don't know that I've made a really good friend since high school, and that's a pretty sad statement. My friends are my colleagues, and that's that's both good and bad. And that would be the second point, is that I remember that for the first part of my career, I would always say, I'm going to separate work from personal and family. And it never worked. And then finally, when, Rodney had the term, when you give into understanding that, at least in the roles that I think we have, sometimes they're absolutely organic. You can't separate, doing work in a local community without your family being a part of that work and who you are. And once I kind of gave over to that, it was actually very rewarding for my family to be a part of my work, as long as it wasn't always about me. And so that was a big part. The last thing I would say is, again, I think that somehow we're all just wired a certain way. Again, because just what life experiences bring to you, I don't get really hung up on things that I can't control. And I try to make the separation of what's important and what's not. That there are certain things that, and I think it would go back to leadership as well. I think good leaders see the things that are important and just as clearly see the things that aren't as important, and let that go by. And as you take on more responsibility, more people talk about you, and that's part of what I would say is not important. And sometimes it's easy to get caught up in what's so-and-so saying about me. Not really important unless it's critical to mission, or a voice that you have to hear. There are a lot of voices that are not positive voices, that no matter the sector, we'll talk about folks who are trying to look into the future and change things. And I think you got to be able to let that go and not focus on, because the energy is so negative, it puts you out of balance in a real hurry.
Great answers. Let me just offer this. See, I think this issue is playing out in every home. This whole issue of relationship between family and work. And President Clinton actually tried to deal with the question from a policy perspective with the Medical and Family Leave Act. If I'm not mistaken, it may have been the first bill passed in his administration. And if you look at all of the recent reports about where we are as an economy, there's a lot of talk about how we stack up, especially with Europeans, and how we work longer, and how basically you almost have to have two members of the family working, husband and wife. And what does that mean when it comes to the family itself? And so this is an issue that is one that we all grapple with, not only from the vantage point of a leadership post that you might have, but also just as a leader in the family. And it's a tough issue to deal with. I've struggled of late with a little equation that I offer, and I thought about it a little bit earlier, but it's faith, family, friends equal fortune. And little play there with words, but I've also struggled with the issue of how do you deal with the question of finance as it relates to that. And I think that I have resolved this in a way that's very comfortable for me. And I only mention the finance because one thing about going from public to private is that becomes, I do think, an issue that is there to deal with in a different way. And so it's before you, it's just there. And so you have to figure out what is a comfortable balance for you as it relates to that. And, it just depends on how much you need most of the time. How much you need. And when you answer that question, you can, I think, more comfortably deal with that particular issue. But to me, fortune deals with much more than finance. And I think that I want to work with this a little bit more, but I think that for me is it. Faith, that's my personal grounding and where I am, which makes me better. And it's a constant struggle because, I think it was Paul who said, that I would, I do not, that I do, that I would not, that I do. You're always struggling with the ideal and your personal, your imperfections. And someone said the other day, I heard this and I like it, human, imperfect, and extraordinary. There's nothing wrong, frankly, with that. And how many people in particular get caught up with that? And girls in especially. And I mention this because my daughter is 13. And a young man the other day said to me, he said, I often would sit with my daughter and I would turn down the volume on the television set. And we'd watch a commercial. And I would ask her, you tell me what they're selling. I thought that was fascinating. And most of the time, what they're selling is not that product. And when you think about women in particular, that is an issue to be addressed. And if you're a parent and if you're a father, you sort of know that things are changing in a way that you have to catch up with, and you definitely want other men to catch up with it because you want your daughters to have a better selection. I told you this issue of fortune is pretty broad. And so I only mention that to say that that she has, though, to see a lot of that in me first. And she's got to see it in my relationship with my wife, yes, but her mother. You follow me? And so this issue is very, very important. And I think we're all trying to do it and do it as well as we can. And it's a job that is ongoing.
But I love the way you brought in the public policy question. Because while we make individual decisions as to how we can get balance in our lives, we also have to be conscious of how many folk don't even have the choice because there are not laws and policies and institutions which assist. When women do not have access to decent, meaningful child care, and because we're still in a period in history and her story when we are incorrectly viewed as the the sole keepers and caretakers of our children, how can there be much balance in her life when there isn't transportation which is affordable for women and men to get to where they need to be and to do what they need to do? How can there be much balance in their lives when family is defined so rigidly as a man, a woman, and 2.5 children, and Fido the dog? What kind of psychological world then must other folk live in who are seeking balance in how they live and work when there aren't jobs for folk? Talk about finding balance. Suppose there are no jobs. So I really like the way that what started out as perhaps a question to each of us personally, you turned into an arena that really does have to do with public policy.
Right. And Dr. Cole, if I may, let me just take that a little further, if I may, because I do think, and I'm reflecting back on your comment early on about the special opportunity you have and how we feel so good, frankly, to be with you and in your presence. But think on the Clinton administration, because that's who the school is named after. Putting people first, that is a powerful sort of, what would you say, you could say magnet, a point of departure, mantra, but it is very, very powerful. And it takes you from, this will use transportation as an example, it takes you from viewing it as concrete, asphalt, and steel, and planes and trains and automobiles, to that tie that binds, that connection from a home that could be in an urban city or rural America, and you've got to get to a job that is someplace else. And you just don't have that affordable transportation. Or even New Orleans, as they attempt to rebuild, one of the big things they need is the whole issue of child care. I mean, they talk about housing and they talk about economic investment, and in the same breath, they talk about child care.
Take care of the children.
That's right. And so these public policy considerations, they have an edge to them that really, in the final analysis, it clearly says whose side you're on. And so I offer that. And if you were going to measure that Clinton administration by any yardstick, I would argue that that's the yardstick. Putting people first. And look at those policy considerations and where the money was spent and where the time was spent, and you can make your judgment about all of that. But I do think that that's a way to make some judgment about it all. And I thought about it actually when you made the point, Dr. Cole.
I want our students especially to notice one thing. If there's the least bit of doubt about how our guests this morning embody public service, the question was directed at their own personal reaction to how they decide on what dreams to leave on the table, to borrow your phrase earlier. And I want you to notice how seamlessly they transform their answer to that question into not about themselves, but about others. And that's truly an embodiment of public service that I think we can all learn from. Marissa, you had another question.
I lived in New York during 9/11, and for the first time in my life, I really saw, or I felt as though color didn't matter, that I was part of America. And so my question is, in a changing America, how does public service bridge the gap between different communities?
Good question. Why don't I'll take a stab at this, and I think that actually those moments of greatest threat and greatest joy take us to that point. And because I think Brian, you remember Brian said, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. Much of this that we use to divide ourselves, to sort of compartmentalize, section off, all of that stuff, in the final analysis, it really doesn't matter. And all too often, it's rather, we think that though is how we articulate our value, our difference, rather than, and that's the least common denominator, rather than seeking to do it from the vantage point of the highest common denominator. those things that we share in common. And it's easier said than done, but I do think that when we are most threatened, we have a shot at it. Also, when we're happiest, I think it comes out of two different impulses for sure. When we're most threatened, we just need a helping hand or a comforting embrace. When we are joyous, then we realize that, joyous, not happy. We realize that it's not, in most instances, about that which is visible or tangible. It's about something that transcends that. And we feel whole enough and big enough and comfortable enough, that's really what I want to get to embrace. That's my rough thinking on this. I'm going to go with that. But I'm ready to take notes because there's a lot to that.
I'm going to be a voice, I hope not of disagreement. But I wanna talk about this is even more textured because I care so much about our ability worldwide to deal with difference. And I have to say that I've never been prouder of my nation than the reactions that happened following September 11th, or following the disaster of Katrina. But I think we are blind if we don't see that even in those disasters, our inability to yet deal with diversity and difference is there. I will never forget that cover of The Economist, which is not exactly a left-wing rag, all right? With that photograph from New Orleans, and the title was The Shaming of America. While we came literally to the rescue of folk who were losing their lives and lost their lives and their families around September 11th, we also then went very deeply into a period of Islamophobia that I say is shameful. So we have got in this nation of ours and around the world such a struggle against all forms of bigotry and discrimination. And it doesn't take much, I think, to move to say that of course race and racism are still haunting us. You know, W.E.B. Du Bois, that great intellectual and activist, said the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Well, shoot, it's the 21st century. We still haven't figured out the color line. And we certainly haven't addressed issues of gender, or sexual orientation, or age, or disability, or religion, or nationality. But at the base, the one we keep ignoring repeatedly worldwide is class. And for us as Americans, it's almost difficult to use the word. What do you mean class? You know, we're a land of opportunity. We're a place where anybody can pull themselves up by their bootstrap. Those ain't got no boots. But the growing gap between those who have and those who have not, until we can address it, and I mean no partisan comment here, but I do believe that ultimately war is not about winning anything. Peace is about not just the absence of war, but it's about the presence of equality and of justice and of dealing with these questions of difference. So I join you in having those moments when it seems like all that divides us is no longer there. But we got to make those moments stretch into the way that it is. The students at Berry College for Women now, I know I've been proud of my students on many an occasion, but I can't tell you how proud I am now. As they take on this question in a worldwide context, Bennett will be the first historically black college or university to be in a relationship with a Millennium Village. These are students in North Carolina saying that somewhere on the continent of Africa, where a child dies from malaria every 30 seconds, they're connected to that. That the notion that 1.1 billion people are poor, that they're connected to that. And so I wanted to lift that because one can rant and rave about inequality. The question is, what are you doing about it? And to somehow infuse that into the daily conscience of our students is important. And let me take one more second to tell you the most thrilling part of it all. And I'm sure if you haven't, you all want to read The End of Poverty. You've got to read Jeffrey Sachs on this, all right? And you've got to come to see your relationship to the Millennium Promise, to the United Nations declared commitment to ending extreme poverty by 2025. But not only are Bennett women, through the Student Government Association, taking on a Millennium Village, we are doing this in cooperation with two institutions that look very differently from us. One is called University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the other is called Duke. And for those of you who are aware of whatever happened with that lacrosse team at Duke, for us to reach across the state and for Duke to reach to us in UNC Chapel Hill to say, let our students together create a relationship with a village somewhere in Africa where we will have some responsibility for helping to say it can happen with seeds and fertilizer, with schools and lunches, with girl children getting education, with family planning, that there is a connection. That's, to me, what really ultimately drives what we all want. And that is individual responsibility for the elimination of this stuff, including poverty.
At the time, the CEO of Radio Shack and then Dr. Cole were the first two board chairs at the United Way of America board as we were trying to rebuild that board and this movement. And one of the things we heard from those across the country is that we've got to build a board of national stature again. And code for a lot of people in that demand of us was the historic board of national stature. CEOs, business CEOs, which it had been when at its heyday. And to lend into Johnetta and to the board's great credit, we resisted that and said, we will build a board. We choose who we associate with, voluntary association. We will select a board of national leaders that reflects who we are as a nation. So we won't just go recruit business leaders. We'll recruit religious leaders and leaders in education and leaders from the gay and lesbian community and leaders from organized labor and business leaders. And the most effective, interesting business leaders I've ever met were not very interested in sitting with other business leaders. They really wanted to sit with other leaders.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't just have to be the national board. It is any organization that voluntarily associates. Build it in a reflection of the aspiration for community. And if we'll do that, there'll be those that'll push back against it and resist it and so forth, but it will be more effective than building a more homogeneous association of any type at any level. And the second piece is the market. There is a current, a flow that can be helpful, not an answer, but helpful in at least the U.S., and that I am increasingly becoming the minority, and that folks of color will increasingly have more influence in not just numbers, but economic influence. If you look at one of the reasons we've been saying to our 1,400 affiliates across the country that you ought to care about diversity for sure, but justice and opportunity is because it's in your economic best interest. So if we look at now our fundraising numbers beginning to go up again, it's driven by, sure, the people who have money, but the fastest growing segment in terms of revenue growth for United Way are women donors, African American donors, Latino donors, gay and lesbian donors, because we have decided that we're going to go back to this idea that we respect everybody as a part of who we are. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with a little enlightened self-interest in terms of if we're going to be relevant and succeed financially, we're going to figure out how the market is changing. And those emerging markets will not allow us long-term to be less than genuine in terms of the engagement. Last thing I would say on this in a very just practical term. One of the things that our oldest daughter, who's now a college freshman, she and I we're the night owls in the family, and so we would sit out on the front porch late at night just talking. And it's, one of the opportunities in these jobs is you do sit and get to have conversations about some important topics with some incredible people. And she said, long before kind of at least today's focus on the economic disparity that's growing in the country and the world, she asked me, Dad, do you ever in these, these big, high-level meetings talk about the fact that the income disparity in the U.S. is growing so fast, and talk about the fact that it's been the demise of every society ever in the history of mankind?
Yes.
It's a great question.
I said, no, it hasn't come up yet. My point is, that's what she and her peers are doing. And so if we care about attracting her, whoever we are, to public service, to your corporation, to your law firm, to your nonprofit organization, you better answer that question. Because that's what she cares about. And again, it's in her interest as well as the nation's and the world's interest. She understands that she doesn't want to be the generation that is presiding over now a failed economy and society. She wants answers to it.
Skip, this is one of your future school members, one of your future students. We have to go. Let's mention one other name. Bill Gates Sr. Was the head of the effort to reach out to these board members that Lynn and Johnetta and that Brian committed to target. And Bill Perret, who's the head of Deloitte Touche, is our chair-elect. So you can see it's all there. We've got strong labor representation. Linda Chavez Thompson, is a leader of the labor movement. We've got others. It's a wonderful group that's coming to Little Rock. And then just a point of personal privilege, if I may. When I started talking about the Delta region and the need in this region that's home for me, I started talking about that rich, flat Delta soil and some of the rows and rows of cotton that I used to pick and the rows and rows of peach trees that I used to climb. But also, just the richness that has given birth to the blues and gospel and rock and roll and all of that. And just this issue of the need for more economic vitality and how so many people are leaving and how, it really is a wonderful part of the country with people who love where they live, and their real challenge is to find continued opportunity there for their kids, especially. And we talked about how United Way might have, number one, the need to listen, but also maybe a few answers. The board unanimously committed to hold this meeting in Little Rock, and we're going to have people from across the Delta region with us later today, and I'm really looking forward to that. And you've kicked us off quite well as we prepare for what I'm sure will be very good, exacting questions from that group as well, and also the wonderful insights that they'll give us. Skip, I think.
Yeah, Mr. Secretary, first of all, thank you all very much for coming. And your point about the Delta, and if I could, I don't know who's going to volunteer to do this, but I would like one of our students to give you just a, sort of in academic terms, a Cliff Notes version of what they're doing in the Delta. So
Right.
I'll yield to the inaugural class to have someone raise your hand and give a quick overview of that. I think it'd be very fascinating.
Okay.
Scott or somebody.
Eric Lawler.
Okay, Eric.
So is that
Well, last spring, the inaugural class members, as will the second class do this year, worked in what we call the practicum. And we went to Phillips County, Arkansas, and we worked with the Delta Bridge Project, which is already a community-initiated project to move forward in some of the areas that they together have identified things that they want to work on, including tourism and quality of life, leadership development, economic development, education, healthcare, I'm missing one, housing, thank you. And the community members have been dialoguing for a number of years on how that they would like to move forward with these items. And as a class, we partnered with the Delta Bridge Project to offer what we thought we could contribute and how they thought we could contribute in the efforts that they were already moving forward with. And it was a great semester. We put together small groups of people within our class to work with each of these teams of community members who were working in the areas, and websites were formed, deals transpired, a lot of research was done, and just got to know members of the community. And that's how we kind of tried to put what we had learned academically in our first semester and all of our prior experiences, which are vastly different, and put them into practice during our spring project.
Excellent, excellent.
It's great work.
Did you?
Very good.
Excellent.
Okay.
Well, I want to, we're coming near the end of our time this morning. We've heard a lot in our conversation today about the immediacy of public service, and which makes it unique. And we mentioned the notion of service and intellectual engagement, which I thank Erica for describing the work that's gone on in the Delta, because it's what the Clinton School does, is that combination of service and academic and intellectual engagement that makes us special. I think you would agree with me that we've could have no better representatives of that service engagement than the guests we've had this morning. And so join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.